I never thought my 62nd birthday would end with me lying on my kitchen floor, clutching my chest while my wife screamed into her phone. And yet there I was, wondering if those would be my last conscious moments. My name is Zachary Donovan, and I have lived in the quiet suburban community of Meadowbrook Hills in Richardson, Texas, for the past 8 years. What happened that afternoon in March would not only change my life forever, but would also spark a legal battle that would reshape HOA regulations across the entire state. The day started normally enough. My wife Diana had invited her sister over for lunch, and her sister's husband had parked their silver Honda Accord in one of the guest parking spots near our townhouse. I remember feeling grateful that the spot was available because my hip had been bothering me lately, and I did not want to walk far if we decided to go anywhere. Around 2 in the afternoon, I started feeling strange. A tightness spread across my chest like someone had wrapped steel bands around my ribcage and was slowly cranking them tighter. Deanna noticed immediately. After 35 years of marriage, she could read my face better than any book. "Zach, you are pale." "What is wrong?" I tried to brush it off, but the pressure intensified, radiating down my left arm. The room started spinning, and I heard Diana's voice become distant and echoing as I collapsed. The next thing I clearly remember is her panicked voice giving our address to the 911 operator while her sister rushed to my side, checking my pulse. The ambulance arrived within 6 minutes, which is remarkably fast. I learned later that the paramedics had actually been on a call just 2 miles away when they received the emergency dispatch. They pulled into the Meadowbrook Hills entrance with lights flashing and sirens wailing, racing toward our section of the community. That is when everything went catastrophically wrong. Brenda Whitmore, the president of our HOA board, was doing her usual afternoon patrol of the neighborhood in her white Lexus SUV. She took her position with the kind of zealous authority that would make a mall security guard look relaxed. Brenda was 53 years old, with a severe blonde bob that looked like it had been cut with a ruler and frosted tips that belonged in a different decade. She wore pastel cardigans regardless of the Texas heat, and had a habit of pursing her lips so tightly they nearly disappeared when she was displeased, which was often. The ambulance was approximately 100 yards from my townhouse when Brenda spotted her sister's Honda in the guest parking spot. According to witness statements I would later read in depositions, she had been watching that particular spot for over an hour. You see, Meadowbrook Hills had a guest parking policy that required residents to register their guests' vehicles with the HOA office at least 4 hours in advance. It was one of those ridiculous rules that nobody followed and that the previous HOA board had never enforced. But Brenda had taken office 6 months earlier with a campaign promise to restore order and property values to our community. She had already called the towing company. The tow truck was pulling up to the guest parking area at the exact moment the ambulance tried to turn down our street. Here is where the situation went from bad to unconscionable. Our street, Willow Grove Lane, was narrow by design. The developer had created these charming curved roads lined with young oak trees, which looked beautiful but left limited space for two-way traffic. With the tow truck positioned to hook up the Honda and Brenda's Lexus parked at an angle behind it, the ambulance could not get through. The paramedic driving the ambulance, a man named Marcus Chen who had been with Richardson Fire Rescue for 12 years, laid on the horn. Through my haze of pain and fading consciousness I heard it, a long desperate wail that should have sent anyone with a functioning conscience scrambling out of the way. Diana heard it too. She ran to our front window and saw the scene unfolding. "Move, please. God, move," she screamed, though they could not hear her through the glass. She grabbed her phone and called 911 again, sobbing that the ambulance could not reach us. Marcus jumped out of the ambulance and ran toward Brenda's vehicle. Video footage from a neighbor's Ring doorbell camera captured what happened next, and this footage would become Exhibit A in the lawsuit that followed. Marcus was clearly agitated, gesturing urgently toward the ambulance and then pointing in the direction of my townhouse. Brenda rolled down her window approximately 2 inches. The audio on the Ring camera was faint but audible when enhanced. "Madam, you need to move your vehicle immediately. We have a cardiac emergency." "This vehicle is illegally parked," Brenda responded, her voice carrying that particular tone of self-righteousness that I had come to know too well from HOA meetings. "I have called for it to be towed. The owner should have registered with the HOA office." "I do not care about parking regulations right now," Marcus said, and I could hear the strain in his voice even through the poor audio quality. A man is dying. Move your vehicle. I am not going to be bullied by city employees who think they can disregard private property rules, Brenda said. This is a private community and we have regulations. If you had used the main entrance properly instead of taking the shortcut through the resident access gate, you would not be blocked. This was insane on multiple levels. First, the ambulance had used the main entrance. Second, even if they had not, what rational human being prioritizes parking enforcement over someone's life? But Brenda was not operating on rationality. She was operating on the intoxicating power that comes from being in charge of something, anything, even if that something was a neighborhood HOA. Marcus made a decision that probably saved my life. He ran back to the ambulance, grabbed their equipment, and he and his partner, Jennifer Kowalski, hoofed it the remaining distance to my townhouse on foot, carrying their cardiac equipment and stretcher. They arrived to find me barely conscious on the floor, my lips starting to turn blue. Jennifer immediately began working on me, placing EKG leads on my chest while Marcus inserted an IV line. Possible myocardial infarction, Jennifer said into her radio. Patient is in severe distress, blood pressure dropping. We need to transport immediately but are blocked from the residence by a vehicle that refuses to move. The 911 dispatcher, a woman named Patricia Rodriguez who had been with the city for 18 years, could not believe what she was hearing. Repeat that? Someone is refusing to move for an ambulance? Affirmative. HOA president is blocking the street. We may need police assistance to clear the route. Police are being dispatched now, Patricia confirmed. Meanwhile, Jennifer administered aspirin and nitroglycerin, trying to stabilize me enough for transport. Every second counted with a heart attack. Brain damage could begin within minutes without proper blood flow. The standard protocol was to get cardiac patients to the hospital within 90 minutes of symptom onset for the best outcomes, and we were burning through that window while Brenda Whitmore sat in her Lexus, arms crossed, refusing to budge. Richardson police officer David Martinez arrived 7 minutes later, which felt like an eternity to Diana, who had been watching helplessly as the paramedics worked on me. Officer Martinez took one look at the situation and immediately approached Brenda's vehicle with his hand resting on his belt. Madam, I need you to move your vehicle right now. Officer, this is private property, and this vehicle is in violation of our community regulations. I am well within my rights to have it towed. Madam, you are currently obstructing an emergency vehicle. That is a violation of Texas Transportation Code Section 545-407. Move your vehicle now, or you will be arrested. For the first time, Brenda seemed to realize she might face actual consequences. Her eyes widened slightly, but her jaw remained set in that stubborn line. I want to speak to your supervisor. You can speak to him from the back of my patrol car if you do not move in the next 10 seconds, Officer Martinez said. There was no humor in his voice, no room for negotiation. 10, 9, 8. Brenda moved. She started her Lexus and pulled forward with exaggerated slowness, making sure everyone understood she was only yielding under duress, not because she thought she was wrong. The tow truck driver, a guy named Roberto who had been watching this circus with his mouth hanging open, quickly unhooked from the Honda and moved his truck out of the way. The ambulance came roaring down the street and pulled up to my townhouse. Marcus and Jennifer loaded me onto the stretcher, continuing their work as they moved. I was in and out of consciousness, catching fragments of conversation and sensation, the metallic taste in my mouth, Diana's hand squeezing mine, the rhythmic beeping of monitors, the jolt as they loaded me into the ambulance. Hang on, Mr. Donovan, Jennifer said. We are going to take good care of you. The drive to Methodist Richardson Medical Center was a blur. I learned later that the delay caused by Brenda's obstruction had added approximately 11 minutes to my transport time. 11 minutes might not sound like much, but in cardiac care, it can mean the difference between full recovery and permanent damage, between life and death. At the hospital, a cardiologist named Dr. Samantha Hayes performed an emergency cardiac catheterization. They found a complete blockage in my left anterior descending artery, the so-called widow maker. Dr. Hayes inserted a stent to open the artery, restoring blood flow to my oxygen-starved heart muscle. The procedure went well, but Dr. Hayes told Diana later that the delay in getting me to the hospital had resulted in more extensive damage to my heart than would have occurred with prompt transport. I cannot say this definitively without a control group, which obviously we do not have, Dr. Hayes explained, but based on the extent of the infarction and the timeline of events, It is my medical opinion that the delay in transport likely contributed to the size of the affected area. Your husband lost heart tissue that might have been saved with faster intervention. I spent 4 days in the cardiac intensive care unit, then another 3 on the regular cardiac floor. The first 2 days were rough. My heart rhythm was unstable, and they had me on a constant drip of medications to keep things steady. Diana barely left my side, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital chair and eating terrible cafeteria food. My kids flew in from different parts of the country. My daughter Rebecca came from Denver, and my son Marcus came from Atlanta. Having them there helped, but I could see the fear in their eyes every time they looked at the monitors hooked up to my chest. During those long hospital hours, Diana told me everything that had happened with Brenda and the blocked ambulance. At first, I was too weak to process it fully. My brain was still foggy from the medications and the trauma my body had endured. But as I grew stronger, anger began to replace the fear and confusion. Someone had deliberately delayed emergency medical care to me over a parking space, not because she did not know it was an emergency. The Ring camera footage made it crystal clear that she knew exactly what was happening. She had chosen parking enforcement over human life. We need to do something about this, I told Diana on my 5th day in the hospital. My voice was still weak, but my resolve was growing stronger. This cannot happen to anyone else. I already contacted a lawyer, Diana said. Rebecca found someone who specializes in these kinds of cases. His name is Martin Fitzgerald, and he wants to meet with us once you are out of the hospital and feeling up to it. Martin Fitzgerald turned out to be exactly what we needed. He was a 60-year-old attorney who had spent the last 20 years fighting HOAs on behalf of homeowners. He had seen every kind of HOA abuse imaginable, from foreclosing on houses over minor violations to discriminatory enforcement of rules, but he told us frankly that he had never seen anything quite like our case. We met in his office in downtown Dallas 2 weeks after I was discharged from the hospital. I was still weak, moving slowly and tiring easily, but I was determined to be there. The office was cluttered with law books and file boxes, the workspace of someone who cared more about the work than appearances. Martin was a tall man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, and he had a habit of tapping his pen against his notepad when he was thinking. "Let me make sure I understand the facts correctly," Martin said, looking over the notes he had taken while Diana and I told our story. "The paramedics arrived at your community entrance at approximately 2:17 p.m. They were blocked from reaching your residence until approximately 2:28 p.m., an 11-minute delay. During this time, Mrs. Whitmore was informed multiple times that there was a cardiac emergency, which is clearly documented on video. She refused to move until threatened with arrest. As a result of the delay, you suffered more extensive heart damage than you likely would have with prompt transport. Is that accurate?" "That is exactly what happened," I confirmed. Martin nodded slowly, still tapping his pen. "This is extraordinary. I have seen HOAs do terrible things, but usually their abuses fall into a gray area legally. This is different. This is clear, documented, willful obstruction of emergency services resulting in quantifiable harm. We have everything we need to build a strong case." "What kind of case?" Diana asked. "We are going to sue Brenda Whitmore personally for negligence and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We are also going to sue the HOA Corporation for negligent training and supervision of their board members, and for maintaining policies that enabled this situation. Additionally, I want to explore criminal charges. What Mrs. Whitmore did was not just civilly liable, it was potentially criminal obstruction." The words hung in the air, criminal charges. I had never been involved in anything like this before. I was a retired accountant, for God's sake. My biggest legal experience before this had been fighting a traffic ticket 15 years ago. But Martin was right. What Brenda had done was not just wrong in a moral sense, it was wrong in a legal sense, and she needed to be held accountable. "I am in," I said, "whatever it takes." Over the next few weeks, Martin began building our case. He obtained the Ring camera footage from our neighbor, Mrs. Patricia Chen, who was horrified when she learned how her camera had captured the incident. He got copies of the 911 calls, including the dispatcher recordings. He subpoenaed the ambulance records and timeline logs. He obtained my complete medical records from Methodist Richardson Medical Center, including Dr. Hayes's notes about the extent of my heart damage and her opinion on how the delay affected my outcome. He also began investigating the HOA's policies and procedures. What he found was damning. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA had no emergency access policy. There was no procedure for how board members should handle emergency situations. There had been no training provided to board members about legal limitations on their authority. The guest parking policy that Brenda had been enforcing so zealously was not even properly adopted under Texas property law because it had never been put to a homeowner vote as required by the community bylaws. Martin also discovered that this was not Brenda's first problematic interaction with emergency services. 6 months earlier, she had tried to prevent a fire truck from parking in a red curb zone while firefighters responded to a kitchen fire at another residence. That time, the fire captain had simply ignored her and done his job. But Brenda had filed a formal complaint with the fire department afterward, claiming they had violated HOA parking rules. The complaint had gone nowhere, but it established a pattern of behavior. While Martin worked on the civil case, he also met with the Richardson City Attorney's Office and the local district attorney to discuss criminal charges. Assistant District Attorney Linda Morrison reviewed the evidence and agreed that there was probable cause to charge Brenda with obstruction of emergency services under Texas Penal Code Section 42.3, which makes it a Class A misdemeanor to intentionally obstruct a highway or other passageway in a way that renders it impassable without unreasonable inconvenience or hazard. This challenge, Linda explained during a meeting with Martin and me, is proving that she intended to obstruct the ambulance. She is going to argue that she was just enforcing parking rules and did not intend to prevent the ambulance from getting through. We have her on video refusing to move even after being explicitly told it was a cardiac emergency, Martin countered. How is that not intentional? I agree with you, and I think we can make the case, Linda said. I am going to present this to a grand jury and seek an indictment. But I want you to know that even if we get an indictment, and even if we win at trial, the maximum penalty for a Class A misdemeanor is a year in county jail and a $2,000 fine. Given that she has no criminal record, she will likely get probation if convicted. I felt a surge of frustration. A year maximum for what she did to me, for potentially killing me over a parking space. But I understood that the law was the law, and at least she would face some criminal accountability. The civil case was where we could really make her pay, both financially and by creating a public record of what she had done. The criminal case moved faster than the civil one. The grand jury heard the evidence in June and returned an indictment against Brenda Whitmore for obstruction of a passageway. I will never forget the day Martin called to tell me. I was in the middle of physical therapy, working on rebuilding my cardiovascular fitness, when my phone rang. "Zach, we got the indictment," Martin said, and I could hear the satisfaction in his voice. Brenda Whitmore is going to face criminal charges. The news hit the local media immediately. By the next day, every news station in Dallas was running the story. HOA president charged after blocking ambulance read one headline. Woman faces charges for delaying heart attack response read another. The story had everything local news loved: a villain, a victim, a dramatic confrontation caught on camera, and the perennial frustration everyone felt toward HOAs. Our Ring doorbell started ringing constantly with reporters wanting interviews. I gave a few, feeling it was important to get the truth out there. Diana was more reluctant, but she did a couple of interviews too. The one that really captured national attention was when Marcus Chen, the paramedic who had been driving the ambulance, agreed to speak to a reporter from NBC Dallas. In 12 years doing this job, I have never encountered anything like that. Marcus said on camera, "I have had people who did not hear the sirens. I have had confused elderly people who did not understand what was happening, but I have never had someone who clearly understood there was a life-threatening emergency and chose to stay in the way anyway. It was surreal, like she did not view the person dying as real, just as an inconvenience to her parking enforcement." The story went national after that. Good Morning America did a segment on it. It trended on social media. People across the country shared their own HOA horror stories in response, though few were as extreme as mine. The phrase HOA blocks ambulance became a shorthand for everything people hated about homeowner associations and the petty tyrants who often ran them. The attention brought something unexpected. Other residents of Meadowbrook Hills started coming forward with their own stories about Brenda Whitmore's behavior as HOA president. Mrs. Janice Kim told reporters that Brenda had threatened her with daily fines because her rose bushes extended 3 inches over the property line. Mr. Robert Jefferson said Brenda had tried to prevent him from flying an American flag in his yard, claiming it violated the community aesthetic guidelines, even though Texas law explicitly protected homeowners' rights to fly the flag. A young couple, Tyler and Emma Morrison, said Brenda had filed a complaint with the county because their 8-month-old baby's crying could be heard outside, claiming it was a noise violation. The stories painted a picture of someone who had let a small amount of power go completely to her head, someone who cared more about rules than people. I actually felt a twinge of pity for Brenda, though it was quickly overwhelmed by anger when I thought about lying on my kitchen floor while she sat in her Lexus refusing to move. Brenda hired a defense attorney, a man named Gregory Ashford, who specialized in HOA defense work. He immediately went on the offensive in the media, claiming that Brenda was being unfairly vilified for doing her job. Mrs. Whitmore is a dedicated volunteer who works tirelessly to maintain property values for all homeowners in Meadowbrook Hills. Ashford said in a statement, "She has been portrayed as a monster, when in reality she was simply enforcing community rules. The ambulance delay was caused by poor street design, not by Mrs. Whitmore's actions. This did not go over well. The video evidence was too clear, and public opinion had already turned decisively against Brenda. Even the other members of the HOA board began distancing themselves from her. 2 of them resigned, citing philosophical differences with current leadership. A third board member, Harold Chen, called for a special election to remove Brenda as president. The special election happened in July. Homeowner turnout was the highest in the community's history, with over 80% of residents casting ballots. Brenda was removed from the HOA board by a vote of 237 to 18. The 18 votes she received were mostly from a small group of elderly residents who still believed that strict enforcement of rules was necessary to maintain the neighborhood, though even some of them later said they would have voted differently if they had fully understood what happened. The new HOA board, led by a retired school teacher named Martha Pina, immediately began reforming the association's policies. They adopted a comprehensive emergency access policy that explicitly prohibited board members from interfering with emergency vehicles under any circumstances. They eliminated the guest parking pre-registration requirement, replacing it with a more sensible system that simply required guest vehicles to display a pass available from the clubhouse or from any board member at any time. They also implemented mandatory training for all board members on Texas property law and the legal limits of HOA authority. While these changes were happening at the community level, the legal cases were moving forward. Brenda's criminal trial was scheduled for September. The civil case would take longer, but Martin was working tirelessly on it, taking depositions from everyone involved and building what he believed would be an overwhelming case. The criminal trial lasted 3 days. I testified on the first day, describing what I remembered from that afternoon and the aftermath of my heart attack. The hardest part was talking about the fear I felt, not just the physical pain, but the terror of not knowing if I would survive, if I would see my children again, if I would grow old with Diana. I saw some jurors wipe their eyes as I spoke. Deanna testified after me, describing what it was like to watch the ambulance blocked in the street while I was dying in our home. "I felt so helpless," she said, her voice cracking. "I had done everything right. I called 911 immediately. Help was there. They were so close, just 100 yards away, and they could not get to us because someone cared more about a parking space than my husband's life." Marcus Chen testified about his interaction with Brenda, and the prosecution played the Ring camera video for the jury. Watching it in the courtroom was surreal. The audio had been enhanced, so every word was clear. You could hear the desperation in Marcus's voice when he told Brenda a man was dying. You could hear the cold indifference in Brenda's response about parking regulations and private property rules. The defense tried to argue that Brenda had not understood the severity of the situation, that she thought the paramedics were exaggerating to get her to move. But this argument fell apart under the weight of the evidence. The prosecution called an expert in emergency medical services who testified that paramedics do not exaggerate medical emergencies and that any reasonable person would understand that cardiac emergency means someone is dying. Dr. Hayes testified about my heart damage and her opinion that the delay in transport likely contributed to the extent of my injury. The defense attorney tried to shake this testimony during cross-examination, pointing out that Dr. Hayes could not say with absolute certainty that faster transport would have resulted in less damage. But Dr. Hayes held firm. "Medicine is not about absolute certainty," she said. "It is about probabilities and clinical judgment, based on my training and experience, and based on the documented timeline and the extent of Mr. Donovan's infarction. It is my medical opinion that faster transport would more likely than not have resulted in less cardiac damage. Every minute counts with a heart attack. Mr. Donovan lost 11 minutes. Those minutes mattered. Brenda testified in her own defense, which I thought was a mistake the moment she took the stand. She was defensive and combative, clearly not following her attorney's coaching. When the prosecutor asked her why she did not move immediately when told there was a cardiac emergency, she said, "I did not know if it was a real emergency or if they were just saying that to pressure me." "So you thought emergency paramedics were lying to you?" the prosecutor asked. "I thought they might be exaggerating the urgency," Brenda said. "People do that all the time to get what they want." "Did it occur to you that the risk of being wrong, the risk that it actually was a real emergency, was too great to take that chance?" Brenda hesitated, and I could see her realize the trap she had walked into. "I suppose, in hindsight, I should have moved." "You suppose?" The prosecutor's voice dripped with incredulity. "Mr. Donovan suffered a massive heart attack. He was dying. You were told this explicitly. And you suppose in hindsight you should have moved?" "Objection, argumentative," Gregory Ashford called out. "Sustained," the judge said. "Move on, counselor." But the damage was done. The jury had seen Brenda's lack of genuine remorse, her inability to fully acknowledge the gravity of what she had done. After closing arguments, the jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning a guilty verdict on the obstruction charge. Sentencing came 2 weeks later. The judge, a no-nonsense woman named Susan Martinez who had a reputation for being tough but fair, listened to victim impact statements before announcing her decision. I gave one, as did Diana. I kept mine short. "What happened to me was terrible," I said, "but I survived. What haunts me is thinking about what could have happened. I could have died because someone refused to move her car. The next person might not be as lucky. I hope this case sends a message that enforcing HOA rules does not give anyone the right to play God with someone else's life." Judge Martinez sentenced Brenda to 90 days in county jail, suspended, meaning she would not serve time unless she violated probation, along with 2 years of probation and 400 hours of community service, which the judge specified must be performed with a cardiac health nonprofit. She also ordered Brenda to pay a $2,000 fine. It was the maximum sentence available under the law. "Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Martinez said, "your actions on March 15th were appalling. You placed your authority as HOA president above the life of a human being. You refused to move your vehicle even when explicitly told that someone was dying. While I am bound by the sentencing parameters of a Class A misdemeanor, I want to make clear that I view your conduct as reprehensible. The only reason you are not going to prison is because the legislature has classified this offense as a misdemeanor. You will serve your community service with a cardiac health organization so that perhaps you will gain some understanding of the real consequences of heart disease and emergency response delays. I hope you take this opportunity to reflect on your choices and to develop the empathy that was so clearly lacking that day." Brenda stood stiffly as the judge spoke, her face flushed red. I wondered if she was embarrassed, angry, or some combination of both. She left the courtroom quickly after the hearing ended, avoiding eye contact with everyone. The criminal case was over, but the civil case was just beginning. Martin had filed a comprehensive lawsuit against both Brenda personally and the Meadowbrook Hills HOA Corporation. The complaint alleged negligence, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violations of Texas HOA law. We were seeking damages for my medical expenses, for Diana's emotional distress, for my pain and suffering, and for the permanent cardiac damage that would affect my quality of life going forward. We were also seeking punitive damages, which are designed to punish particularly egregious conduct and deter future similar behavior. The HOA's insurance company initially tried to deny coverage, arguing that Brenda's actions were intentional and therefore not covered under the liability policy. This would have left the HOA on the hook for potentially millions of dollars. The HOA's attorney filed a third-party claim against the insurance company, arguing that even if Brenda's specific actions were intentional, the HOA's negligent training and supervision were covered under the policy. This created a complex three-way legal fight that took months to sort out. Eventually, the insurance company agreed to provide a defense under a reservation of rights, meaning they would defend the case but reserve the right to deny coverage later if a court found that the actions were not covered. This was important because it meant we had a deep pocket potentially available to pay a judgment Rather than just going after Brenda's personal assets and the HOA's relatively modest reserves, the civil case proceeded through discovery, the process where both sides gather evidence. Martin took Brenda's deposition, questioning her under oath about her actions and her decision-making that day. I was not allowed in the room during her deposition, but Martin told me afterward that she had been evasive and defensive, still maintaining that she had been doing her job properly. Martin also took depositions from the other HOA board members who had been serving at the time of the incident. They testified that the board had never received any training on emergency situations, that they had never discussed how to handle conflicts between HOA rules and emergency access, and that Brenda had been running the board with minimal input from the other members, making most decisions unilaterally. We also took the deposition of the HOA's management company representative, a man named Kevin Torres, who handled administrative tasks for several HOAs in the area. Kevin testified that his company had offered to provide board training on legal issues, but that Brenda had declined, saying the board did not need it because she knew the rules. The defense took my deposition as well, questioning me extensively about my medical history, trying to establish that I had risk factors for heart disease that would have caused problems regardless of the delay. It was true that I had high cholesterol and that my father had died of a heart attack at age 67, but Dr. Hayes had already addressed this in her report, explaining that while I had risk factors, the extent of damage was still consistent with delayed treatment. As the case progressed, Martin proposed mediation, a process where a neutral third party helps both sides try to reach a settlement. This is common in civil cases because trials are expensive and unpredictable for both sides. The insurance company agreed, seeing it as an opportunity to potentially resolve the case for less than what a jury might award. The mediation took place in January, 10 months after my heart attack. We met in a conference room at a neutral location in Dallas. The mediator was a retired judge named Thomas Brennan, who had a reputation for being effective at bringing parties together. The process involved both sides presenting their case to the mediator, then the mediator shuttling back and forth between separate rooms trying to find common ground. Martin laid out our case clearly. We had video evidence of the obstruction. We had medical testimony about the harm caused. We had a criminal conviction demonstrating that Brenda's actions were unlawful. We had evidence of systemic failures by the HOA in training and supervision. He argued that this case was worth millions, both in actual damages and in punitive damages. The defense argued that my medical history showed I was at high risk for a heart attack regardless of any delay, that some of our damages claims were speculative, and that punitive damages were not warranted because the HOA itself had not acted with malice. They offered $150,000 to settle. Martin laughed when the mediator brought us that offer. That is insulting. Zach's medical bills alone are over $180,000, and that does not account for future medical needs, lost quality of life, or the emotional distress Diana suffered. Tell them we will consider $2.5 million to settle. The mediation went on for 8 hours, with offers and counteroffers bouncing back and forth. By evening, we were at an impasse. The insurance company had come up to $600,000, but Martin insisted we needed at least $1.8 million to make settlement worthwhile. The mediator urged both sides to think overnight and reconvene the next day. That night, Diana and I talked about what we wanted. The money would be nice, certainly. Medical bills had been piling up, and I had been forced to retire earlier than planned due to my heart condition. But more than the money, I wanted accountability and change. I wanted to make sure this could never happen to anyone else. If we settle, the case goes away, I said to Diana. If we go to trial, we create a public record. Other HOAs will see what happened and maybe think twice before pulling something like this. But going to trial is risky, Diana pointed out. What if the jury does not see it our way? What if they decide the delay did not really matter, or that the HOA should not be held responsible for Brenda's actions? Martin seems confident we would win. Lawyers always seem confident. That is their job. She had a point. We talked it through most of the night and eventually decided to give Martin authority to settle if the offer reached $1.5 million, but to prepare for trial if it did not. The next day, after more back and forth, the insurance company came up to $1.2 million. Martin pushed for more, but they would not budge. We decided to proceed to trial. The trial was scheduled for May, more than a year after my heart attack. As the date approached, I felt increasingly nervous. Martin had explained that trials were unpredictable, that juries sometimes did unexpected things, that there was always risk. But I also felt that we were doing the right thing, not just for us but for everyone who had ever been abused by an HOA board member on a power trip. The trial lasted 2 weeks. Jury selection took a full day, with both sides questioning potential jurors about their attitudes toward HOAs, toward emergency services, toward personal responsibility. We ended up with a jury of 12 people from various backgrounds: a retired teacher, a software engineer, a small business owner, a nurse, 8 others with their own perspectives and life experiences. The trial itself covered much of the same ground as the criminal case, but with more detail and more focus on damages. Martin called expert witnesses to testify about HOA governance standards and how Meadowbrook Hills had failed to meet them. He called a vocational expert who testified about how my reduced cardiac capacity would affect my future earning potential and quality of life. He called a grief counselor who had worked with Diana to testify about the emotional trauma she had suffered. The defense continued to argue that the delay had not caused significant additional harm, that I would have had cardiac damage anyway, given the severity of my blockage and my risk factors. They tried to paint Brenda as a well-meaning volunteer who made a mistake under pressure, conveniently ignoring the video evidence of her stubborn refusal to move even after the situation was explained to her. One powerful moment came when Marcus Chen testified again, this time in the civil trial. The defense attorney asked him if he could say with absolute certainty that we would have reached the hospital 11 minutes sooner if Brenda had not blocked the street. No, Marcus admitted. There could have been other delays, traffic lights, another emergency call. We cannot know what would have happened in an alternate timeline, so you cannot say for certain that the delay caused harm? Marcus looked directly at the defense attorney. What I can say is this. In my 12 years as a paramedic, I have learned that every second counts in a cardiac emergency. I have seen people live or die based on how quickly we get them to the catheterization lab. Mr. Donovan lost 11 minutes because someone refused to move their car. Based on my training and experience, those 11 minutes mattered. They mattered a lot. The defense rested after 8 days of trial. Closing arguments were scheduled for the following Monday. Over the weekend, Martin worked on his closing statement while I tried to distract myself with anything other than thinking about the trial. It was hard. This case had consumed more than a year of my life. It had been stressful and exhausting, dredging up the trauma of that day again and again. Monday morning came. The courtroom was packed with spectators and reporters. Martin delivered his closing argument, walking the jury through the evidence methodically. He showed the Ring camera video again, letting Brenda's own words condemn her. He reminded the jury of Dr. Hayes' testimony about the cardiac damage I had suffered. He talked about Diana's trauma, about the fear and helplessness she felt watching the ambulance blocked in the street. This case is about accountability, Martin said. It is about what happens when someone lets a tiny amount of power go to their head and forgets that they are dealing with real human lives. Brenda Whitmore chose parking enforcement over a dying man. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA chose to put an untrained, unqualified person in charge with no oversight and no policies to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophe. They need to be held accountable, not just for what they did to Zach and Diana Donovan, but to send a message to every HOA in this state that you cannot put rules over people's lives. The defense closing argument emphasized that Brenda had been a volunteer trying her best, that the HOA had limited resources and could not be expected to anticipate every possible situation, that my heart attack was caused by my own medical history and lifestyle, not by an 11-minute delay. It was a tough sell given the evidence, but the attorney did his best. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Those were possibly the longest 2 days of my life, even longer than waiting in the hospital to find out if I would survive. Every hour that passed without a verdict felt like torture. Martin kept telling me that a longer deliberation was not necessarily bad, that it might just mean the jury was being thorough, but I could not help but worry. Finally, on Wednesday afternoon, we got word that the jury had reached a verdict. We rushed to the courthouse and took our seats. The jury filed in, and I tried to read their faces, but they were carefully neutral. The judge asked if they had reached a verdict, and the foreman, a middle-aged man who worked as an engineer, said they had. The verdict was read aloud. The jury found in our favor on all counts. They found that Brenda had been negligent. They found that she had intentionally inflicted emotional distress. They found that the HOA had been negligent in its training and supervision. They awarded us $380,000 in economic damages for medical bills and lost earnings. They awarded us $750, zero in non-economic damages for pain and suffering and emotional distress, and then came the big one. They awarded $3.2 million in punitive damages against Brenda personally and $1.5 million in punitive damages against the HOA. The total verdict was $5.83 million. I heard Diana gasp beside me. Martin squeezed my shoulder. The courtroom buzzed with excited whispers until the judge gavelled for order. I felt tears running down my face, though whether they were from relief or vindication or just the release of a year of pent-up stress, I could not say. The defense immediately filed a motion for a new trial and indicated they would appeal, which was expected. But Martin was confident the verdict would hold up. The evidence had been overwhelming, and the jury award, while substantial, was not so excessive that an appeals court would be likely to overturn it. The case made national news again. Jury awards nearly $6 million in HOA ambulance blocking case was the headline in the Dallas Morning News. The story was picked up by major news outlets across the country. Legal experts weighed in, with most agreeing that the verdict was justified given the egregious nature of Brenda's conduct and the documented harm I had suffered. More importantly, the verdict sparked action at the state level. A Texas state representative named Jennifer Wu introduced legislation that would require all HOAs in Texas to adopt emergency access policies and to provide training to board members on emergency situations. The bill, which became known as the Donovan Act, would also create civil penalties for HOA board members who interfered with emergency services, separate from any criminal charges. Representative Wu reached out to me and asked if I would testify before the state legislature in support of the bill. Despite my lingering health issues and my general desire to put this whole nightmare behind me, I agreed. This was important. This could prevent someone else from going through what I went through. I testified before the Texas House Urban Affairs Committee in Austin in June. I told them my story, keeping it simple and factual. I explained how close I came to dying, how much permanent damage my heart suffered, how traumatized Diana still was more than a year later. I urged them to pass the Donovan Act so that no other HOA board member would think they could prioritize rules over human lives. I do not want other people to have to go through what I went through, I said. I do not want other families to have to watch their loved ones die while someone refuses to move out of an ambulance's way because of a parking violation. This should never happen again, and with your help, maybe it will not have to. The committee passed the bill unanimously. It went to the full House where it passed 142-3. The Senate passed it 28-2. Governor Richards signed it into law in August, and it took effect immediately. The Donovan Act requires all HOAs in Texas to adopt written emergency access policies that prohibit interference with emergency vehicles and personnel. It requires board member training on these policies and on the legal limits of HOA authority. It creates a private cause of action allowing people harmed by HOA interference with emergency services to sue for damages. And it establishes civil penalties of up to $10,000 per violation that can be assessed by a court. Other states began considering similar legislation. Florida passed a version in 2026. California followed in 2027. By 2028, 18 states had some form of HOA emergency access law on the books, many of them explicitly modeled on the Donovan Act. The appeals process on our civil case took another 18 months, but ultimately the verdict was upheld. The Texas Court of Appeals found that the jury award was supported by the evidence and that the trial court had not made any reversible errors. Brenda and the HOA's insurance company eventually settled with us for $4.9 million rather than continue fighting, which was fine with us. After Martin's contingency fee and case expenses, we ended up with approximately $3.1 million. The money helped. We paid off medical bills and set aside funds for future cardiac care that I will need for the rest of my life. We paid off our mortgage. We set up college funds for our grandchildren. But the money was never really the point. The point was accountability and change, and we achieved that. Brenda Whitmore completed her community service and probation without incident. She moved out of Meadowbrook Hills about 6 months after the trial ended, reportedly relocating to Arizona to be near her daughter. I have no idea what she is doing now, and honestly, I try not to think about her. What she did was terrible, but holding on to anger would only hurt me, not her. The Meadowbrook Hills HOA, under new leadership, has become a model for responsible governance. The board holds regular training sessions. They adopted policies that emphasize reasonableness and flexibility over rigid rule enforcement. They work with homeowners rather than against them. Property values in the community have actually increased since the reforms, putting the lie to the idea that strict enforcement is necessary to maintain a neighborhood. I still live in Meadowbrook Hills. Some people suggested we should move after everything that happened, but this is our home. We have friends here, memories here. What happened to me was terrible, but it was not the community's fault. It was one person's fault, and she is gone now. My health has slowly improved, though I will never be what I was before the heart attack. I tire more easily. I have to be careful about exertion. I take a handful of medications every day and will for the rest of my life. I see my cardiologist every 3 months. Dr. Hayes told me that the damaged heart muscle will not regenerate, so I am living with reduced cardiac capacity permanently. On bad days, I wonder what my health would be like if Brenda had just moved her car 11 minutes sooner. Would I have less damage? Would I be able to do more? There is no way to know, and dwelling on it does not help. Diana went through counseling to deal with the trauma of that day. She still gets anxious when she hears sirens, still has occasional nightmares about watching the ambulance blocked in the street. But she has gotten better with time and therapy. We are closer now than we were before, if that is possible. Going through something like this either tears a marriage apart or makes it stronger, and thankfully, we ended up on the stronger side. Marcus Chen and Jennifer Kowalski, the paramedics who saved my life, became friends of ours. We have dinner with them every few months. They tell me they were just doing their jobs, but I know better. They could have waited for the police to clear the street. Instead, they grabbed their gear and ran, getting to me as fast as humanly possible. I owe them my life. I think about that day often. I think about how a normal afternoon turned into the worst day of my life in a matter of minutes. I think about how close I came to dying over something as stupid as a parking space. I think about how one person's inflated sense of authority and complete lack of empathy nearly killed me. But I also think about the good that came from it. The Donovan Act has changed how HOAs operate across multiple states. Thousands of HOA board members have received training they would not have received otherwise. Emergency access policies have been adopted by communities that never thought about the issue before. Maybe, somewhere someone's life has been saved because an HOA board member remembered what happened to me and chose to prioritize human life over rules. That is worth something. That has to be worth something. On the 2-year anniversary of my heart attack, Diane and I planted a tree in our front yard. It is a live oak, the kind that grows strong and lives for generations. We planted it as a symbol of survival, of putting down roots and continuing to grow even after trauma. The HOAs has no rules against trees in front yards, and if they did, I would plant it anyway. Some things are more important than rules. I water that tree regularly, watching it grow, watching new leaves unfurl each spring. It reminds me that life continues, that there is always growth possible even after the worst days. It reminds me that I survived, that we survived, and that something good came from something terrible. That is the story of how an HOA blocked an ambulance over a guest parking violation, and how the lawsuit that followed changed HOA law across America. It is a story I never wanted to live through, but I am glad that some good came from it. I am glad that my suffering might prevent someone else from suffering the same way. I am glad that Brenda Whitmore and the Meadowbrook Hills HOA were held accountable for what they did. Most of all, I am glad I survived to tell this story, to plant that tree, to see my grandchildren grow up, to grow old with Diana. Every day since that afternoon in March has been a gift, a second chance I almost did not get. I do not waste those days. I spend them with people I love, doing things that matter, trying to leave the world a little better than I found it, and I never ever take parking violations seriously again.